Okay, let's get into period 9 right now. Reagan, really the rebirth of the conservative movement, going back to traditional roots. Period 9, exclamation point, will be done this week, 1980, really to the present. I compare it to period 1, where it's not ever going to show up on an LEQ or a DBQ, but it could show up as a short answer question or a few multiple choice questions. So it's nothing that you would ever really need to remember in terms of evidence, but main ideas of period 9 I think are pretty important. And Reagan is probably the most important part of period 9. If you look at the 1980 election, notice the sea of red. He destroys Carter, not only in the popular vote, but look in terms of the electoral vote, 91% essentially. You only have Carter winning a few states. Other than that, it's a landslide because this is a conservative reaction to Democrats, to the past Democratic presidents, in particular Carter, as well as LBJ to some extent, for the deficit spending that's going to occur. So just to reframe some issues from the 1970s, and there's Jimmy Carter running. Anyone own a pair of shorts like that? No? No? Okay. It's a common thing, apparently, for presidents to do. Even George Bush was an avid runner. Problems for the Secret Service. But 1970s, right, you have détente, you have relaxed tensions, but you still have that, you haven't solved the whole Cold War issue yet, and it's going to last for about another 20 years. You have oil crises, you have, right, the embargo problem, the shortage of gasoline, which created many problems domestically. You even have crime rates rising in the 70s as well as the 80s, especially when crack gets, there's a big crack epidemic in the 70s and 80s, which is going to be problematic. Stagnation, or stagflation rather, domestically. And people had this feeling that the United States wasn't this great superpower, that the feeling that you got after World War II really had drifted off. And a lot of people were looking at Carter as the blame of that. Henry Kissinger, of course, being the Secretary of State under which president? Which president? Emily? Emily's not going to help you. She's snorkeling right now. Thanks, Nixon. Very good, Dylan. Can't say your last name because this is going public on the World Wide Web. So yes, Henry Nixon, still thinking that the U.S. is still the greatest power, but there are many problems domestically and to some extent abroad that need to be controlled. Of course, you did have some progress with the SALT treaties, if you recall the strategic arms limitation talks, but they fail in SALT II, if you recall, because the Soviets are going to be invading Afghanistan. And then you also have problems with Iran with respect to the hostage crisis, which Carter does not handle all that well, which was pretty much an epic fail. In terms of foreign policy, remember, you had the Camp David Accords, perhaps Carter's greatest achievement in terms, because remember, he's this great humanitarian, he's all for peace, but at the end of the day, suffers a lot of criticism because of the domestic economy and how he handles things such as Iran. Kissinger, as well, is going to try to create stability. He's not necessarily looking for democracy. This notion that the U.S. should just spread democracy wherever it goes obviously is not the case, as you have staged coups by the CIA to prevent communism. They don't care if they're not democratic, they just don't want them to be communistic, because communism was seen as more of a threat. Of course, we have détente. Another thing that we're going to see is the Helsinki Accords, and which you're listing about 10 provisions. Not as, I wouldn't make this similar to like Wilson's 14 points, but they were a step needed to really thaw the tensions, and it was really in the spirit of détente. For example, borders should not change for Europe, so basically what the Soviets have, that's what you keep. Let's not change the borders. Increased trade, typically when you have better commerce between countries, that will lead to stability. For example, people are always afraid that China is going to attack us. That would be the dumbest thing in the world, because they would be committing financial suicide with the billions of dollars that they get from U.S. commerce. I mean, probably the back of your shirts or whatever product we own today is made in China. So that was also the idea as well. And then there's going to be this emphasis on human rights as well. So human rights, which the Soviets are going to agree upon, and this is going to be important when we get to the end of the Cold War, which is nearing under Reagan, where you have this concept of perestroika, which is the Russian word for restructuring and reform that's going to come about, where they're no longer going to become communistic. And then you also have this other Russian word known as glasnost, in which it means openness, where the Soviets will be transparent. But more on those concepts a little bit later. So Reagan in the 1980s election, this should say denounced, not enounced, but attacks Carter's foreign policy, looks, for example, at the failed Iranian hostage crisis, denounces the government of the Great Society, right? All this spending, social engineering. One thing that's going to come out under LBJ is affirmative action. This is still like a somewhat controversial concept, especially as many of you are going to be applying for college. He's going to see an increased role in the federal government, especially in, like, for example, with schools. Schools are a reserved right, a reserved power under the 10th Amendment that local boards of ed should control. Under LBJ and Democrats, you see a greater hand of the federal government where, to Reagan's point of view, the government doesn't belong, the federal government, that is. So he's going to condemn that. So he's going to be, again, appealing to middle, working class whites in particular. What's interesting, too, is in the Democrats who are starting to dislike him as well, because not a heck of a lot gets done under Carter, is this anybody but Carter movement. You have Ted Kennedy, the relative brother of Robert Kennedy as well as JFK, primaried Carter. Fails, though. Carter will still get the nomination. And then you also have a challenger to Reagan, John B. Anderson. But the problem is, this is very much a conservative reaction to prior Democrats. So they, this voting bloc of Reagan really wants a conservative returning to traditional roots, and Reagan is that person. And Reagan, of course, if you knew anything about his past, anyone know what his prior occupation was? Yeah, he was an actor. Yeah, so quite interesting there. Okay, so Reagan becomes president, and one of the funny taglines that he asked American voters, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And for most Americans, the answer was no, because of the economy. So upon becoming president, you have Reagan dealing with the whole hostage crisis. What's interesting is on election day, which of course is in November, you still have hostages being held. He is secretly negotiating with Iran at this point to have them be released. Because if they were released prior to the election, that would be a major victory for Carter. And he did not want Carter to do that because that would look favorable for him. Gasoline at this point, too, greater percentage of income than today. You could be spending up to 5, 6, 7% of your income on gasoline. Today, for most people, it's like maybe 1 or 2%, depending on how long your commute is. So looking at the amount that's consuming, hurting people economically is an issue. Of course, as we talked about, Carter's failed attempt to rescue hostages fails. So Americans see Carter as making the United States weak. There's this general sense that Democrats are very weak. So Reagan, who is a great admirer of Rambo, anyone familiar with what Rambo looks like? He's like this, he almost looks like an Arnold Schwarzenegger. Reagan was a great admirer of this character. So Reagan's going to, again, try to restore American greatness and pride, fresh start. And what do you know? On his inauguration date, the hostages are released. I mean, what a way to start your presidency, to have the Iranian hostages released. However, still at this time, you have Soviets still in Afghanistan, economy still awful, something that he's going to deal with. And this is the Ayatollah in Iran. So Reagan's foreign policy is going to deviate a little bit. The idea of being strong, get over it, flex your muscles. Certainly, it's like Democrats were just viewed as this being weak, and now you have Reagan, who's, I'm tough. I'm not going to negotiate and show any weakness on the side of the Americans. With Reagan, it's an entirely different foreign policy. At least that's the impression he's trying to give off. One thing that he's going to try to do, put more military pressure on the Soviet Union. In particular, in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, the leader, is able to control the airspace, which the Soviet Union is trying to invade, by being able to launch missiles. And that was the aid that we gave to Iran. It's sort of interesting to think that the United States and Iran were allies at one point, because today it's very murky. Again, in light of the coup that the United States had staged. Reagan's also going to build up a 600-ship Navy. He's going to even promise a strategic defense shield, which essentially could station satellites in orbit to defend the U.S. territory against nuclear attacks using lasers. So he's promising all of this coming about in 1983. He even denounces the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And this is really interesting because this is in the era of détente. And now you sort of see tensions being raised a little bit, sort of getting tough on the Soviet Union. So definitely a little bit more aggression. In this evil empire speech, he's going to sort of say, look, the Soviets are being aggressive, they're violating human rights, and he also focuses on human rights. I mean, similar to Carter, but this is different in the sense that he's willing to use muscle to protect human rights. And it goes back to, I think, what Emily had asked earlier in terms of, with McKinley, is this just an excuse? In some ways, yeah, it is a way to shape the American feeling that we're doing this for a humanitarian reason. In the end, I mean, communism is still seen as a threat, perhaps not to the extent that it was once seen after World War II. All right, last slide here. So the Reagan Doctrine, overwhelming global Soviet influence, increased sanctions on the USSR, Poland as a satellite state. You're still backing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, as the Soviets had invaded, will later pull out of there. One speech that he gives in Great Britain is the Westminster speech. And at this point, he's going to make an alliance with Margaret Thatcher, who's also a conservative there. She's one of the most hailed conservatives, especially as a woman, in the 1980s in Great Britain. And they basically make an alliance. And it's very similar to World War II, when the United States is going to make an alliance with Great Britain against Hitler. I mean, maybe it's not to the same degree, but you still have this pact that's going to be made and solidified. So you have the SDI being able to vaporize your ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles. So you have that. You have increased military spending, which is going to, again, show the muscles being flexed by the United States, which is going to put the United States into some deficit spending, meaning that you're going into debt. But that was okay for conservatives if it's spent on the military. If it's spent on like social liberal programs, that was a problem. But for defense, conservatives are generally okay about that. In response to the renewed efforts of the Cold War and sort of getting away from détente, the Soviets are very much upset, and to no surprise, they're going to boycott the Olympics, which were being held in Los Angeles at that point. And if you look at the medal count, the United States just like takes it away. Prior Olympics, you would be neck and neck with the Soviet Union in terms of the medal count, but the United States just destroys it as a result of the Soviets not basically boycotting the LA Olympics. Okay, so that was a lot of notes. So try to digest that as the best as you can. Now for tonight, be sure to check out the screencast, which will hopefully be posted by around 3 o'clock. We'll be getting into Gorbachev. We'll be ending the Cold War. So a lot of good stuff happening. Okay?